Peace and blessings, everybody. Welcome back to my channel. My name is Oubria, and if you've never watched any of my videos before, I do a mix of tarot reading, spiritual teaching, Bible interpretation, and I also talk a great deal about my own personal life experiences for however they may benefit you. So welcome. I'm glad that you clicked on this video. Today, I want to talk a bit about the spiritual bloodline of the underdog. Okay. Jesus said in the Bible that the first will be last and the last will be first. And, a lot of people have interpreted that in many ways over the years, but I want to talk about I just want to use like specifical, that's not a word. I want to use specific biblical references to explain what I think that means and to maybe give you some peace and comfort about whatever you've been going through in your own personal life. Okay. So the two examples that I want to use are David and Joseph, who I believe are distant relatives in the heritage of, in the bloodline of Jesus. But if I'm not mistaken, Jesus actually is related to them through his father, Joseph. And Joseph technically is not his father because, Mary she was immaculate. She conceived immaculately without semen. So according to the story. So, Jesus is not actually their blood relative. He's God's son, right? So that's why I'll say I want to talk about this in terms of like a spiritual bloodline, because it's not actually, in terms of my understanding, a bloodline. But y'all can correct me if I'm wrong. The comments are open. Okay. So let's talk about Joseph, okay? Because he was, well, actually, who was first? I can't remember who was first, Joseph or David. I think Joseph was first, but I could be wrong about that. But let's talk about Joseph first. Okay, so for those of you who don't know, and I'm not going to give you specific Bible verses and things like that. I'm just going to tell you the story because I'm a storyteller. But I am also doing that because I encourage you to look up this information for yourself. Don't go by me, go by you. Okay, and I explain that in another one of my videos. Because I think spiritual and personal discernment is most important. So don't go by me. Listen to me, but don't go by me. Okay. So from my understanding, okay, Joseph was one of 12 sons. His father, I believe his father was Jacob. His father Jacob had 12 sons. I think 10 of the sons were through because Jacob was in the unique position of he fell in love with someone before he could actually marry them. So first he fell in love with Rachel, but Rachel was too young to be married. So he agreed to work for Rachel's father for 7 years so that he could then marry Rachel when she got a little bit older. And then the father said, well, Rachel's older sister, Leah, still has not married anyone. So I need you to marry Leah first, and then you can marry Rachel in another 7 years. So most of his sons came through his true love's sister, Leah, right? She bore 10 sons for him. And so that's a whole lecture in itself. But then once he finally married Rachel, she had a lot of trouble conceiving. So she didn't really have many kids. I think she only had 2 kids. And the second kid she had, Benjamin, she actually died in childbirth, giving birth to him. So she struggled a lot with fertility. But one of the sons that she gave birth to was Joseph. So you have to understand that Joseph was, of all his father's children, he was one of the only loved children because Jacob really loved Rachel. He really loved Joseph's mama. But Leah, it was more so a marriage of convenience and circumstance. Okay. So God really blessed And for some reason in the Bible, God really tends to bless the children whose mothers have difficult circumstances. And that's a whole nother series in itself. But if you just look through the Bible yourself, it seems like the mothers who are barren or who really pray for God to open their womb or who struggle with things like that, their children always come through with like hella blessings or anointing. So Joseph was born with the ability to dream prophetic dreams and also the ability to understand prophetic dreams. And at one point he had a dream about basically he had a couple of dreams where, long story short, he dreamed that his brothers and his parents would like bow down to him. He had a dream where he was like in a position of power and they were subservient to him. And when he told his brothers and his father his dreams, they got really pissed off at him and they got jealous of him. And they called him that dreamer, you know, like with a really negative connotation. And so his brothers conspired to kill him. And then at the last minute, one of his brothers, Reuben, said, "Nah, let's not kill him," because secretly Reuben wanted to return Joseph to their dad. He didn't think that it was cool what his brothers was doing, but he wasn't going to speak up in front of his brothers and say that. But he was like the lone voice of reason, and he said, "No, don't kill him." So they didn't kill him. They ended up like stripping him of his beautiful robe that he would wear, and they put him in like this thing of water, this cistern that was supposed to hold water, but it was empty. And then they sold him to some Egyptians for like 20 shekels. So they sold him into slavery. And I think that they then like killed an animal and put the animal's blood on Joseph's coat so they could take the coat back to the father and tell the father that Joseph was dead. So the father really thought that Joseph was dead, but the brothers all knew that he had been sold into Egypt. Okay. So once he was in Egypt and he was a slave, the Pharaoh had a dream. And nobody could interpret the dream except Joseph. So even though his brothers meant harm for him, he wound up being put in a position to help the most important person in the land at that time, who was the Pharaoh. And the way that he interpreted the dream was to say that there was going to be 7 years of abundance followed by 7 years of lack. So he was put in a position to help Pharaoh strategize to where they stored up the grain during the 7 years of abundance so that during the 7 years of lack, nobody starved, right? And then it ended up that Joseph's brothers and them, during those 7 years of lack, when nothing would grow in the land, they wound up coming to Egypt to see if, I think they was trying to like sell something or see if they could get some help or something like that. But they wound up realizing, or like through a series of tests that Joseph put them through, he revealed to them that he was actually their brother that they had sold into slavery. And he said, "See, you meant to do me harm." And I'm paraphrasing here, but he basically said, "You meant to do me harm, but I wound up being put in a position to not only save my own life, but to save y'all lives too." Okay. Two things that I want to point out about that story. Number one, if you find yourself, if you find that you share your dreams or your goals or your aspirations or just like your innermost beautiful self with people in your family or people who are supposed to be close to you, and they hate on you and they plot on you, number one, that sucks. But number two, that is part of that spiritual bloodline of the underdog. Please believe that if God put a dream in your heart, he did not put it there for no reason. It will come into fruition. But if you find that you're surrounded by people who just hate you because of your light and they plot against you, you also need to know that ultimately their plots and plans will only serve you. Like, just like I said in my other video, this is chess, not checkers. Just play your position and try not to let your heart be bitter because of it, because you never know what God's ultimate plan is. And a lot of times when God is like sending us through persecution, just like a chess piece, we're actually being put into position. Joseph was put into a particular position, not only to glorify God, because who could have saw that coming, but also to help save his father and his brothers, although his brothers didn't deserve it. But God says, you know, if anybody can forgive or bless an evil person, but it takes true divinity to forgive and to bless those who ultimately don't mean the best for you. So we are called to forgiveness, especially once we're blessed. I mean, what's the point of being mad? If Joseph's brothers had not did what they did, then everybody would have perished. So ultimately, the Most High used their hatred and their pettiness to benefit them and their brother and their father, right? So it all turned out for the best. The other thing that I want to say about that story is you'll notice that there was one person among Joseph's brothers who said, let's not kill him. And that was Reuben. Sometimes when you're in situations like that where it seems like everybody is against you, God is always going to put one person in the mix who actually fucks with you, like who actually supports you and cares about you and doesn't want to hurt you. But that person may not be able to openly express that because of the haters around. So that person will kind of do things behind the scenes to bless you or to save your life that you won't necessarily know about. So just remember that as well. If God is going to persecute you to put you in a position, there's always going to be a Reuben. There's going to be somebody who cares about you and who protects you, but they cannot do it openly, right? So just don't ever assume, even when you feel like everybody is your enemy, don't ever assume that everybody is your enemy, because 9 times out of 10, that's not actually the case. Okay, so that's the story of Joseph. That's the example that I wanted to use as far as a spiritual bloodline of the underdog. The other example that I wanted to use is the story of David. David, just like Joseph, was one of the least of his brothers. Because if you think about the fact that Joseph, even though he had this ability to dream, in terms of his family, he was one of the least of his brothers because most of all the brothers had one mom, Leah. So he was kind of like an outsider. He wasn't their stepbrother, but he was like their half brother. All 10 of them had the same parents. And so he was kind of an outsider. Okay. Also, they were all a lot older than him because I feel like he was one of the last born, like I said, because Rachel has so much trouble conceiving. So David was very similar. David was the youngest of this guy named Jesse's sons. And the reason that David was put into the position that he was put into is because initially God had chosen this dude named Saul to be king, but Saul was such a disappointment. It's one of the few places in the Bible where it says God was actually sad. It says God was sad that he made Saul king, because that's how much of a fuck up Saul was. He wouldn't do what God told him to do. He was out here building monuments to himself after not following God's instructions. Like, he was just a pitiful excuse for I don't even want to get into Saul, but Saul had really pissed God off. Okay. To the point that the prophet who anointed Saul, after he told Saul that God was disappointed in him, that prophet literally did not talk to Saul again his entire life. He was like, so we're so done with you. Okay. So God told Samuel, the prophet, he said, okay, so I'm not going to let Saul be king anymore, but I need you to go anoint the next person who will be king. And he sent him to this house of Jesse, and he said, I've picked one of Jesse's sons to be king. Samuel looked at all of Jesse's sons, but God was like, nope, that's not him, that's not him, that's not him, that's not him. And like one by one, he dismissed all of the strong, tall, older brothers. And David was the youngest, the baby boy who was out back, I think, doing something in the wilderness, because that was his wheelhouse. He loved being outside. And God was like, yeah, that was the one. And he was very young at the time. But don't forget, that's the same David who wound up killing Goliath. The reason that he was able to kill Goliath is, okay, so let me just go back. Remember how Joseph, what blessed him was the fact that he could interpret Pharaoh's dreams. That was something, that's a gift, the gift of prophecy that he was just born with, right? Something that God gave him when he was very young that nobody could take from him. It's the same with David. The reason that David was able to kill Goliath is because even though he was the youngest of his brothers, he was extremely brave. And before he even killed Goliath, he was out here killing bears and tigers and wrestling with wild animals with his bare hands. So he had this like God-given courage and strength placed in his heart as a very young child. And it was that very trait that, number one, helped him survive all the years that I'm going to tell you about that he was in the wilderness. But number two, it's helped him have a good, strong heart to be king. Okay. So Goliath was a Philistine that was just jacking up the Israelite army, and they needed a strong soldier who could face him and fight him. So they picked David, and David wound up slaying Goliath, which really impressed the king Saul, right? So unbeknownst to Saul, though, David had been selected by God to replace him, but Saul did not know that. Okay. So, but Saul was so impressed with David that he kind of invited him into his household, and David ended up living at the palace, right? But then it's like, because of his, so remember, so you see how Saul wanted to use David for his strength, but then it ended up that people were so impressed by his strength and by like all the times that he would go out into battle for Saul and succeed. The people came up with a song, and part of the song they would say, Saul has killed his thousands and David has killed his tens of thousands. So Saul started hearing this song and started being a hater, like, oh hell no, people out here saying that I've only killed thousands and David has killed tens of thousands. So then after that, Saul wanted to kill David, and he sent him away from the palace, or rather David left the palace, I forget what, but either way, he wound up living in the wilderness for like a good 20 years trying to escape Saul, because Saul, even though Saul was the king and David was one of his people. Let me just pause while this airplane goes by. Saul was always trying to kill him because he was just driven crazy with jealousy about the strength and the power and the courage that this young boy had. So he tried to kill him. And so David lived in the wilderness, living by his wits, his courage, and most importantly, I mean, David pretty much wrote most of the book of Psalms based on his experiences when he was in the wilderness. And if you read the Bible, you know the Psalms is a book of praise and thanksgiving, but also like begging for God to protection. Psalms can be used for protection, for praise, for thanksgiving, for all those things. But if you read them, there are times where you can tell that David was just greatly troubled and stressed out and scared and did not know if he would make it from one day to the next. And it was through that experience that he really got very, very close with God. They grew like this very close personal relationship because God was David's pretty much his only friend. Now, remember when I talked about Reuben, who made sure that Joseph didn't get killed? David's other friend was Jonathan, and Jonathan was Saul's son, but Jonathan was David's best friend. So even though his father wanted to kill him, Jonathan loved David and he looked out for him in lots of different ways, even though it was like a direct conflict of interest. Now, once again, I will say, when you're in a position where you're being persecuted or hated on by the people who are supposed to be close to you, you know, whether it's your boss, like in the case of David and Saul, or whether it's your actual brothers, as the case with Joseph, there's always going to be someone, okay, feel me, just like Jonathan, who really fucks with you, who loves you, cares about you, who will protect you. But that person cannot always reveal, you know, their position, because if they did, then it would mean more harm for you, because then they couldn't be in that place to protect you the way that they do. Okay, so those are just the two examples that I want to use. And what's crazy is it's if not for Saul's persecution of David would not have been such an amazing king. It was because he lived with his soldiers that he knew how to fight. He knew how to send them into battle. It's like and they responded to him. It made them so loyal to David because they witnessed him surviving all these tests and trials that Saul put him through. So it inspired such a deep trust that they didn't necessarily have in Saul, because Saul just kind of, you know, sat on his throne and just like sent out these orders, and he only went to war if he thought it would glorify and benefit him. Do you know what I mean? But David was like a man of the people. Okay. Now, he wasn't perfect. We can get into that in another video, because I do want to talk about that as well. But for the purposes of this video, I just want to talk about how it's like Saul's persecution of David pretty much resulted in on-the-job training, which is what made David a better king than Saul. So if Saul had not come to hate him and persecute him, David would not have been the great man that he became. I mean, it's a reason why his name is still in our mouth all these thousands of years later. And I guarantee you, if he had not like gone through all these tests and trials, we wouldn't still talk about David, and we wouldn't still talk about Joseph if his brothers had not sold him into slavery. So it's whatever the enemy has planned for you, please understand that God is just using that to either put you in a position or to train you up for a position, or both. But just understand that it's, number one, it's strategic. So do not let your heart become bitter. And number two, there's always going to be somebody who fucks with you, who protects you, who loves you, but cannot reveal that to you. So don't assume that everybody who is in your enemy's camp is actually your enemy. Remember that. Okay. So that's just what I wanted to say in terms of the first will be last and the last shall be first. David and Joseph were literally like one of either the last of his brothers or one of the last of his brothers. And they were treated the worst. They were put in the least position, but they turned out to be the absolute greatest. Okay. So whatever it is that you're going through, if it just like it's almost like a blessing, like wear that as a badge of honor, and understand that it is like a promise of your future position. The fact that you are being persecuted now, or if people are lying on you or backstabbing you, or you feel like there's nobody that you can trust, just know that it's almost as good as God's promise that your life is going to be great and there's a purpose for you, and that right now is just kind of like your training. Okay, right now is the test before the testimony. So I just wanted to encourage you and lift you up today, and just share that with you. Okay. So that's all I have. If you want to talk with me, you can always email me. I'll put that information in the description box below. As well as my website, if you just want to know more about me or more about what I do. Okay. Peace and blessings to you. Oh, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel. Okay. That's all I got to say. Peace and blessings, y'all.